In January of 2022, I made one of the most hardest, best, but most difficult decisions I've ever made in my life. I decided I wanted to become Ada Lovelace. A software engineer. This was a complicated process that involved learning what the full stack was. For me at the time, the full stack meant a sort of hamburger. And I heard about all these technologies, CSS, HTML, JavaScript, but also databases, MongoDB. And there was just so many different components and so many different things to learn that I was really confused about what should I focus on. And so what I ended up is finding Swift and finding a great programming language that I could learn on. And and I haven't looked back since. There was also a world of possibilities, and that was really confusing to pick my backend. I could do Kotlin and go the Spring or the Cato route. I could use PHP to do Laravel or even Symfony programming. I could do Python with Flask or Django. You get the idea. Basically, most programming languages, they have the yin and the yang, two different server-side backends that are fighting for dominance. And then there's JavaScript, where they've decided that they only want to shoot themselves in the foot once with Node.js. Anyway, that wasn't really helping me. What I needed was clarity, to know exactly how I should make my own decision. In the intervening years, I've been told, or I've learned through conversations with people who actually do backend and who actually know how to do backend properly, that I should look at things like tooling and scalability, the different features, the level of difficulty, even whether there's a hiring pool, although I'm not exactly sure that's pertinent since I'm not hiring anyone. Sorry for that. I should also look at performance and whether the batteries are included, whatever that means. Anyway, at the time, I was convinced that there was no way that Swift could run on the server, which of course is a horribly wrong misconception that I hope nowadays people don't have. But way back in 2022, I did believe that. And so on my first day of work, I told the senior iOS engineer on my team that I was really struggling finding a backend. And what he told me is that there was this awesome server-side Swift framework, called Vapor, and that I could actually write my backend in Swift. This would mean that I could write my iOS client in a language I knew and understood, and I could also write my backend in that same language without having to learn a new programming language at a time where I was already still struggling to learn Swift properly and to write the idiomatic Swift that we all want and aspire to write. So I was like, oh, music to my ears. I think the best developers are lazy and they like comfort, and that was the lazy and comfortable approach. And I'm really happy that I went for it. But despite making that choice at the time, I still lacked a mental framework to decide on what backend technology to use. I defaulted to Vapor, not because it was actually the best by performance metrics or a deep analysis, just because it wasn't a programming language I mastered. Later on, I started hearing noise and rumors about this new super cool framework called Hummingbird that also allowed us to do server-side.swift. And so in the summer of 2024, I decided that I wanted to do some Hummingbird programming, and so I started programming in Hummingbird. This talk is essentially an attempt, _attempt, at giving you a mental framework, a model to use on how to make the best decision for you based off of what you're trying to achieve with your backend. So this statement comes with strings attached, a whole bunch of disclaimers, and legal mumbo jumbo. So first of all, I'm not standing here today to start a civil war. plenty of other people are doing that on their own. I'm going to stick to just this funny meme. Well, I think it's funny. I don't think you should debate programming languages. I don't think you should even debate what the best backend framework is. I don't even think you should debate the best server-side Swift framework. I think you should debate what server-side framework best suits certain use cases, certain needs that you can have, whether it's for a personal project or inside your company if you're one of those forward-thinking companies that uses new technologies. Furthermore, I want to insist on the fact that although I'm going to show you a bunch of code, I'm going to try to back all my statements up with as much facts and arguments as possible, this is still going to be my own very personal opinion. And hopefully, I will be able to underscore with you how humble and humbling it is to stand before all of you, because I think that it's pretty safe to say that most people here have a lot more experience than I do in this thing. So I want to be extremely humble, and I invite you all that if there's something that I've fumbled or that you have a question at the end, please feel free to raise your hand and correct me. As my buddy Daniel said, but I want to underline it, I write production code on iOS apps. So I do write some Swift as best as I can with SwiftUI every day, but I don't write backend code every day. So I think that's a very important thing to underline. First of all, this may seem counterintuitive, but I think that before we delve into the many differences between Hummingbird and Vapor, I just want to talk about their similarities and how they're more alike than you might think, and that these similarities go a lot further than just it's the same programming language. First of all, they're both HTTP servers. Of course, I could talk about a bunch of other topics and networking layers and stuff like that. I have no knowledge of that, and so I'm just going to stick to HTTP servers. And for example, if we think about routing, Vapor does it pretty much like this. You have a route function that gets called from the main function. The main is the one that's called when you boot up your server. And in this case, I'm just returning hello world, simple get request. Of course, as Daniel pointed out yesterday during our fundamentals workshop, there's really no point to a server that just says hello world. We can write slides for that. Instead, what we can do is go a step further with Vapor, and we can build what are called controllers. I'm sure you're all familiar with them, but I just want to explain it for those who maybe have not handled controllers before. Controllers are pieces of software that allow us to really follow the solid principles when writing backend code and essentially group a series of endpoints that are related, either because they have basically the same prefix in the route, and send those requests into that controller. And so as you can see, we basically instantiate a log controller. In this case, I called it logging controller. You could have it for polls controller or whatnot. And all the protocol, route collection protocol does is just require you to have a boot function, which is what the framework is going to call when routing it towards that endpoint. And as you can see, you can have get, and the use function just the use parameter just allows you to pass in what function should be called to handle that network call. So as you can see, when the /login endpoint receives a GET request, it uses the index method, post uses create, and so on and so forth. Hummingbird does pretty much the same trick. Yeah, this looks really good actually on the big screen. A lot less good on the monitor. But basically, as you can, if you look at controller.addRoutes, you can also instantiate a controller and group all the all the network calls that go to login into that particular controller. And if we look at what the add routes method does, it will just take a group and get, pause, put, patch, delete, and allow you to do exactly the same thing as we just did with Vapor. So there's not really, I mean, there are some servers, right, that make network calls and that send whatever network call information they receive back to the caller, but that's not the usual use case. Usually you're going to want to persist some data in storage in some way or another. And so what's really cool is that our friends Adam and Johannes have built a package that's called Hummingbird Fluent, and that this means that Fluent, which for those of you who don't know, is the ORM that is used for, within Vapor and can be used in Hummingbird to query relational databases. So an ORM is an object relational mapper, and it is essentially a layer of abstraction over whatever query language you have. And so it allows you to not write SQL when you don't know how to write that, or you think you know how to write SQL, but you can't really, and you don't know that you can't. Which really creates some huge problems. But that's a story for another day. And so if we look at how we use, for example, Fluent in Vapor, and I'm not going to give you the Hummingbird example because it's essentially the exact same code we are going to decode. So this is a create. So this is a sort of post request to create a new user. And by the way, this is something that you can find on their, when you start up a new project, this is what's already there. I did not, I'm not sharing code I wrote because I wrote it 2 years ago and it's embarrassing. But basically you decode the user DTO from the incoming request. You make it into a model. That's what the toModel method is for. And then you save it inside the database and you return the user DTO. And so we've seen that the routing looks pretty much the same. Now let's talk about middleware. But before I got ahead of myself. Before I go into the middleware and how it's pretty much very similar in Hummingbird and Vapor, I just want to touch a couple of words. I just want to speak about what a middleware is. A middleware is essentially a layer of software that will handle a request before it's passed on to a controller and then pass it on to said controller. There's a whole bunch of things you can do. I'm going to show you in a second. There's logging middleware, there's tracing middleware, there's all sorts of middleware you can use inside your Hummingbird and Vapor applications. And just in general, it's a very common industry standard. So in this case, we're using what I call the built-in middleware. This is essentially the middleware that is provided by both frameworks. In this case, this is Hummingbird code, and I'm using the login request middleware with an info level. So essentially, it's going to give me a bunch of info level logs about what is happening inside my Hummingbird application, and that's super interesting to know. We were talking about this with Agam yesterday of Apple, but basically it's a lot easier to debug with those sort of logs and traces if need be than to have to put breakpoints all over the place and play the requests. Hummingbird has a bunch of other built-in things. Course is cross-origin resource sharing if you're serving a React or web client, login requests, you have metrics and tracing, so that's already built in for you. But of course, you can also build your own if you're into that sort of thing. For example, this is the example from also the documentation. It's called admin middleware. As you can see, it's just as simple as conforming to a simple protocol and implementing a function with a certain signature. You do what needs to be done, and then you return, try, await, and you pass in the request so that it's sent on to the login controller. Again, you can do really anything you want. This is the same thing, but in Hummingbird. And I'm not doing anything there, but just to give you an example that it can be done, and yeah, it's very similar between the two. You can also add it to specific routes. They're also both open source projects. I know that all of you know this, but what I want to really touch upon is the incredible virtues that there is in both of those frameworks being open source. First of all, you can see what code you're executing, which we have a lot of libraries where we have no idea what's happening. But in this case, we can, and we can have a deeper knowledge of that. You can also create GitHub issues. I have done so. Sorry, Adam, and sorry, Johannes. And they've very kindly helped me figure out what an e-tag is and why I didn't need it. And same thing with Vapor. You can open issues. You can also make contributions, but I would invite you to read the contributors.md file before you start your pull request, and make sure that you're communicating with the maintainers so that there's no bad surprises on either side. But essentially that can also help you if you've got really a feature you need or a direction you want to go because of the product you're building. You can have a conversation with them about that too. And this is my water break, sorry. And so they're basically obvious for obvious reasons. They're not exactly the same framework, and I just want to touch upon the differences that both have and that you really need to take into account. And these are actually the most important part. The first one, and this is a criteria that never gets talked about, but I want to speak about community. I personally find that the Vapor community is more vibrant and that there's more people in it, especially if you go on their Discord. You'll see a lot of newcomers, a lot of people asking questions and helping each other out. And so for that reason, I think that you should come to the dark side because we've got cookies. The other thing is that I kind of have to confess to something, and that is that I lied to you. So if we talk about persistence again, because there are actual differences in persistence, Vapor and Fluent support, Vapor and Hummingbird do support Fluent. They just do it in what I think is a fairly different way. So this can seem like a detail, but the whole Hummingbird support thing is a package that you need to add to your package.swift. For some of you, that may be trivial. For me, I'm a huge fan of the Vapor CLI, where when you spring something up, it just asks you, do you want Fluent? And if so, which SQL DB do you want? This is just a matter of personal preference. A lot of people are really comfortable just building their own Legos with whatever they want and adding stuff to their package.swift that they need, and that's entirely fine. I just want you to be aware of essentially the differences that there is. But of course, both support them, so that's still true. And then in terms of Hummingbird, this is a matter, so under little side note, but I ran this by Adam and Tim, and there was quite an amount of debate about database support. So Mongo Kitten, which is written by Johannes down here, so if you've got questions, you can direct it to him. But basically, Mongo Kitten works on Hummingbird and on Vapor. And all of these that you see are Apache Kafka and Apache Cassandra, I think, are both clients that are built by Apple, if I'm not mistaken. If I am, please correct me. But essentially, Hummingbird will have what I think is a better options in terms of NoSQL databases. I've also heard that the Passwords app at Apple uses Cassandra and that they have Vapor too, so I think you can make it work either way. I suspect it'll just be easier to use Hummingbird for that, just because it's more geared towards, bring your own lunch sort of thing and build as you go and make your own decisions. My point is that Vapor is the more opinionated one. It'll hold you by your hand as you begin your server-side Swift journey. It will help you to make less mistakes in the beginning. It will also sort of constrict you into one particular way of doing things. This doesn't mean that you're condemned to do them that way. It just takes a lot more than if you use Hummingbird, because Hummingbird affords developers greater flexibility. But the problem with that, well, it's a strength, but the problem with that is that, as Uncle Ben would say, with great power comes great responsibility. A case in point of that is authentication. What I like to call how to shoot yourself in the foot. Before I talk about authentication, I can't resist the temptation about talking about threat modeling. When I built my personal project for my end of school project, I did not need OAuth 2. I was not securing classified databases, and you should really adapt whatever authentication method you're using to whatever threat you think you're going to face. And unless you're Apple, you're probably not facing non-state actors and state actors. Anyway, side note aside, both frameworks support basic authentication. For those of you who don't know basic authentication, just a quick walkthrough. Basically, the client makes a request to a resource that is protected, usually by middleware, 99.99% of the time. This request is sent down an unauthorized HTTP code. The client will have logic to prompt the user for a username and password. Then a request will be made with that username and password. I'll spare you the details. There's like a semicolon you've got to have, and like it's base64 encoded. It's sent into the authorization header, and boom, it's sent to the server. The server is then going to match that hash against the hash it's got stored. Word to the wise, do not store passwords in plain text. I can't believe I have to say that, but yeah, even if it's a personal project, you don't do that. So please don't do that. And this is like a clever schema of what happens. But yeah. So in Vapor, this is just an example of how the routes are protected. Unfortunately, I'm not going to go in depth about how authentication works on Vapor, because most of the time when you're building enterprise software, you're probably going to want to do JWT anyway. Suffice it to say that the code is very similar. However, there's just a quick disclaimer. Hummingbird, this is the complicated part of the talk, people, so strap your boots in. Hummingbird uses what it calls a request context. So by default, there's a request context is essentially, as its name suggests, the context around your request. It contains things like the encoder, decoder, and size limit, I believe. By default, the framework will generate a basic request context. However, when doing authentication, Hummingbird relies heavily on you using a authenticated request context, which is a particular request that supports authentication and that you can then pass as a context to your routes to protect them. I'm not going to go into further detail because I'm scared I'll faceplant in front of all of you, and I'm already on a perilous mission enough, so I don't want to risk it anymore. But yes, definitely something to look into is the differences in authentication between Hummingbird and Vapor, and the fact that a huge strength of Hummingbird is that you have type-safe request context that you can tweak and add in order to better protect your application. Vapor does not have a request context, at least not one that you can pass into and use like that. And then you pass it to the router. Of course, there's also support for JWT on Vapor and Hummingbird, but the differences in basic auth are the exact same ones in JWT. I've been told by my buddy Eric, who's a fellow speaker, you'll hear him tomorrow. I can't wait to hear that talk. It's about cryptography, so it's going to be fun. But that OAuth 2 is authorization, not authentication. But I've put it in the authentication part. But this is supported today by Vapor only. So that's another thing that if you want to support OAuth 2 through Imperial, sorry. And now, finally, I want to just make a quick aparté about performance, benchmarks, and deployment, because these are hugely important things, of course, that you're going to need to think about if and when you're going to build your project, hopefully when, in Hummingbird or Vapor. So I have not made performance benchmarks. There are several reasons for this. The first one is that performance is really going to be a byproduct of, I'm sorry to say it, by how well you code, by how well you write your SQL statements, if you write your own SQL statements, how well you use Fluent, whether you're smart in the way you chain your queries and stuff like that. And I think that you should think about your data structure, what data you're going to be needing on your client, how you want to store it, and then you should test Vapor and Hummingbird against those and also see what different drivers there are for the database of your choice. But there's no point in me really talking to you about, oh yeah, I sent 100,000 requests on my localhost 8080 and surprise, there's a difference. There probably will be, I don't know in which sense, but anyway. And finally, for deployment, both have very similar deployment options. The most popular, I'm guessing, because this is what I did, is containers, Docker containers. Vapor comes with that out of the box. Hummingbird, if memory serves me well, also. And so you can deploy your application as a Docker container. You can hand it to a Kubernetes cluster to scale if scale is something that's going to matter to you. And likewise, if you're worried about scale, you can use AWS Lambdas too. Hello, Seb. To wrap it all up, you can't go wrong with Vapor or Hummingbird because you're using Swift. No, just kidding. Just because they're both awesome frameworks. It's great to compare both when you're thinking about starting your project and to really think deeply about your choices, about whether you're open to contributing to open engineering resources to making these frameworks grow. If there's a DB driver you're going to build or whatnot. But it's also important to know that whichever one you choose, you'll make what I think is an excellent choice. And so in the end, I'm sorry, but I'm going to give you the standard developer answer to what is the best XYZ. It depends. I'm going to give you just this quick schema, but basically it sums up the differences. Vapor is more opinionated. Both have very similar drivers. Vapor has a warm and welcoming community. I find Hummingbird's documentation is a real strong point. They both have the option to use Fluent ORM, which is hugely helpful when you're starting off and you don't want to write your own SQL. They're both open source. They both run on Docker and or on Lambdas. In the end, it's all about the trade-offs you're making, the sacrifices you're making, and how you're thinking about your future and the future of your project. Do you really want to start off with a bunch of Legos and start building, or do you want to already have certain building blocks already in place that you can just stack up and very quickly move on? Of course, this would not be a presentation at a Swift conference if there wasn't a one more thing slide. And it's too bad because Tim has left just as I was going to thank him for inviting me to speak. Typical. Oh, sorry. Thank you, Tim. He was there in the shadows like Batman. And thank you to all the organizers, the volunteers who make this conference possible. You don't get recognized enough, and I've just had an amazing experience here in London for the past day, so thank you so much for the invite. When I started off coding, never in my wildest dreams would I have thought that I would be standing here in front of you talking about my experience with two frameworks, especially in front of the people who did it. And then the last thing is, I know how daunting it can be to submit to a CFP. I know how a lot of people, and this was myself, don't think that their experience mattered or that they had something to share with the community. I can assure you all have something to bring to the community, and you all have super interesting stories and talks. And I know because I've spoken to some of you, not all of you, of course. I wish I could speak to every single one of you. But please, please, please consider becoming a speaker next year. I never thought my talk would get accepted when I submitted it, but here I am. So I invite you to take your own chance. And finally, just some watching. This TV series on Apple TV Plus, it's awesome. And they wear the same Apple jackets as I'm currently wearing. So yeah, thank you so much for listening to me. And now if there are any questions, feel free to ask them to the maintainers.